Hello National 5. This video just covers some of the terms from the variation and inheritance topic. There's a lot of these to remember and sometimes the difference between them is a bit tricky. Most of them come in pairs. For example, we will talk about words like genes and alleles, we'll talk about phenotype and genotype, we'll talk about heterozygotes, homozygotes, we'll talk about different levels of things. And it's often difficult to remember which one's which, so I thought it might be nice for you to have a reference video that you can use. Just quickly going through what we've done on the previous lesson, you've looked at different kinds of variations. So obviously variations are just things that are different between different organisms. If we're looking at leaves, we could look at different trees and we could say, well, this tree has leaves that have 3 lobes, whereas this tree has leaves that have 2 lobes. This would be what we call discrete variations because it's easy to categorize them into distinct groups. That's the terminology the National 5 course wants you to know, distinct groups. It's quite often because these things are controlled by a single gene. So if we remember our basic genetics, if this is a chromosome here, we've got our DNA strand, if we zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, and this section here will be one gene, just like the section below it will be a single gene. So this part of the DNA will code for a single protein. Now, if a trait, a characteristic is controlled by one gene, the letters here might be A, T, 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 C, 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 G. And that will give you, say, green eyes. But if it's A, T, 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 C, 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 A, that will give you grey eyes or blue eyes. A change to that one area will make a different protein. So it's easy to say, well, what gene do you have for that characteristic? If you have the one that gives you brown eyes, you will have that. If you have the one that gives you blue eyes, you will have blue eyes. They're distinct because they're controlled by a single gene. With continuous variation, so for example, if we take the tree analogy, you might look at an oak tree and say that oak tree is 15 meters tall. But actually, it's not 15 meters tall. It's 15.0100. You can go until the end of time down to an atomic level and get a more and more and more precise reading on the exact size of that tree. Really, at this point, you're not looking to categorize into individual groups. You're saying there's a minimum number I found from my sample and there's a maximum number, and all of the data is somewhere in between those points. This is because continuous variation is what we call polygenic. It's controlled by multiple genes. So if we take skin color, because that's an easy one to picture in our head, there's actually 3 different genes that control skin color. We'll call them gene A, gene B, and gene C. For gene A, you could have different alleles. So this is the word we use for the different forms of the gene that we had here. So the different DNA letters will give you a different form of the gene. So if you think about it, if in eye color we have brown, blue, emerald, and grey, at this locus here, this one A, we could maybe have 4 or 5 options. But we have another 4 or 5 options at B, and another 4 or 5 options at C. The number of different ways you could bring those genes together and make different combinations of the alleles is absolutely huge. Even if we simplify skin color down to you've got 3 different genes that control it, but you can only have 2 alleles. You can only either be, say, a capital A allele or a lowercase a. That still gives us 81 different skin colors. So you can see traits that are controlled by multiple genes, you can get a much wider nuanced range of different appearances from that gene. And there's some things in your body that are controlled by 10, 11 genes. So you can imagine how many different combinations you can get for that. So continuous variation is polygenic, controlled by multiple genes, and the range of values fall between a minimum and a maximum. These are the terms we look at today. We look at gene and allele, phenotype, genotype, dominant recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, and a P, F1, and F2. If we start where we already are with gene and allele, we remember we've got our chromosome. So if we zoom into the chromosome, as we've said before, we found the part of the chromosome that is a gene for something. So it doesn't matter which human you go into. If this is chromosome 7, say, because they're numbered, if you go into chromosome 7 and you go down to exactly this spot, you will find the gene for, we'll say, I don't know, whether or not you can roll your tongue. That's a good example of a discrete variation. So the gene for rolling your tongue, we'll say, is chromosome 7 at this part here, this gene there. So you either can roll your tongue, so that's an option. So you'd have an allele, a combination of letters here that means you can roll your tongue, and a combination of letters there that means you cannot roll your tongue. So those would be the two forms of that gene, the two alleles. Now we'll talk about later in the video how you categorize that, because you don't want to have to write down every time you want to say someone can roll their tongue, you don't want to have to write down can roll their tongue. We just use a single letter. We'll look at that in a second. So for any gene, hair color, eye color, whatever it is, we have the gene, and then we have the forms of that gene, which are the alleles. They are caused by having a different sequence of DNA bases in your strand. We have two more terms. Again, this comes as a pair. We have phenotype and genotype. So again, we've simplified our chromosome down here. Say this is chromosome number 1. And if we go down to this part of the chromosome here, we have the gene for hair color. Now, on both of these copies, we have the same letter. This is the capital B, which in our example here will give you brown allele. So if you have the capital B allele, you are going to get the brown hair protein. So the gene was hair color, the allele was brown. The phenotype and the genotype are what we're going to look at here. So your genotype is the two alleles you have. So you get one allele from your mum and one allele from your dad for each gene. In this case, both parents have given the capital B allele. So we just take the space out and write them beside each other. If down here we had another gene and it was capital A, the genotype would be capital A, capital A. If it was capital A, lowercase a, the genotype would be capital A, lowercase a, and if it was lowercase a, that's the genotype. So you just write down the two letters you get from the chromosomes. The phenotype is the outcome of the genotype. So we tend to think of it as, what does the person look like? Because for things like hair color, if you have the brown hair allele for the gene and the brown hair allele for the gene, your appearance will be brown haired. If it's eye color, you've got the black eye, I don't know why I picked black, but anyway, black eye allele and black eye allele, your phenotype will be black eyes. So we've talked about the gene, hair color, the allele brown, the genotype, in this case capital B, and the phenotype brown hair. So the genotype will give you the phenotype. If you know what these letters stand for, we'll talk about how it gets a little bit complicated later on. The most important thing with questions on phenotypes and genotypes is to look at the question and it will tell you what letters to use and what the letters mean. So again, we've got the gene, it gives you the alleles. The genotype for brown eyes might be capital B, capital B. The genotype for blue might be lowercase b, and we'll talk about how you would then end up with different examples here. Dominance and recessive. So there was a man called Gregor Mendel. He was a priest and a scientist in one of the Germanic countries I can never remember. And what he noticed was that if you mated a purple flower with a white flower, all of the children that he had in his stock from those two mating came out purple. And he said, well, that's a bit weird. You would expect it to be 50% purple, 50% white. And what he worked out was that purple flowers was the dominant allele. So in a situation where both parents are given the purple allele, that's fine, the flower's purple. In a situation where both parents are given the white allele, that's okay, it's white. In a combination where there is a contest, you've got a purple and you've got a white allele, what is the phenotype? Is it half purple, half white? If you do higher biology, we'll talk about occasions of incomplete dominance where that is the case. But in this case, no. If there is a contest, so if you have a purple and a white allele, you will have the purple phenotype. So In terms of dominance and recessives, if we take this example here, this person got a capital B allele from the mum and a lowercase allele from the dad. In the question here, it tells us that capital B is brown and lowercase b is redhead. Interestingly, there is quite a few different hair colours that are what we call recessive to brown. And brown itself is recessive to black. So the letters you're using and which one is dominant, which one recessive, will vary from different questions. So in this case, the capital letter will always win out over the lowercase letter. So we say the capital letter is dominant to the lowercase letter. And we know these letters represent alleles. So for the gene of hair color, if you have a capital B and a lowercase b allele, your genotype is capital B, small b, and your appearance would be the dominant alleles phenotype. So brown hair in this occasion. If instead of writing brown, I'd decided off the cuff to write the word blonde, that person's phenotype would be blonde. If I'd decided that was going to be green, was a capital B, and redhead was lowercase b, in this case, the person would have green hair. I get to decide when I write this question what the letters mean. So in different questions, you can't always think capital B is going to be brown, lowercase b is going to be redhead. It will vary question to question. We move on. When we are looking at phenotypes and genotypes, we have the words homozygous and heterozygous. Homo means the same, hetero means different. So look at this one. Do these two have the same allele? They do. They both have the capital B. Do these two have the same allele? They do. They both have an uppercase R. These both have a lowercase r. This one, they have a copy of each. Just like in our example here, we have a copy of each. So the terminology we use for this is homozygous and heterozygous. So if both alleles are the same, we say it's homozygous. That can be homozygous with the dominant allele or homozygous with the recessive allele. So using our brown hair dominant, red hair recessive example, capital B, dominant dominant would be homozygous dominant, would give you that genotype and that phenotype. Homozygous recessive in that example will give you lowercase b genotype and will give you the redhead phenotype. And the genotype capital B, lowercase b, will give you the brown phenotype because brown is dominant. You can see from this that it's only in the heterozygote that it matters which one is dominant, which one's recessive. You might also notice that the only occasion that you will have a redhead person is when they are homozygous. You cannot have the recessive phenotype appearing for the organism if the genotype isn't homozygous recessive. This is something that we come and talk on next lesson when we do what's called Punnett squares and crosses. So homozygous to the same allele in the genotype, heterozygous to different alleles. The final thing we're going to look at is what's called a pedigree or a family tree. It's very simple. We don't go into complicated genetics at National 5. So P stands for parental. Obviously, these two have their own parents. They are the progeny, the offspring, the children of different people, hopefully. But for our purposes, we are saying, just like we got to decide what these letters stood for, in our example, these are the first parents. They have children. So these two mate and produce 4 offspring. They have this chappie here, who's got brown hair, this individual with blonde hair, this individual with black hair, and this individual with brown hair. So these are their children. They are what we call the F1. Now there's a Latin word filial. They are the first filial. You don't need to know that. They are the F1. It's always difficult to remember that the parental generation is parental. They are not number 1. Quite often you see in other courses talking about first generation, second and third. We don't do that in National 5. We talk about parental and then the first level of offspring and the second level of offspring. So obviously within the National 5 course we have to do what's called outmating. So these two's children have to mate with people who are not their siblings. So this person here mates with this person here. And you can see they will form their own parental generation. and they will produce the F2. Using Punnett squares, we can predict what the phenotype of each of the offspring are. So if we know these two's genotype, we maybe know this one is lowercase b, and this one is capital B. I can use my knowledge of genetics and biology to tell you exactly what the genotype and phenotype of their offspring is. So we've looked at hair colour as a gene, an example of a gene. So that's part of a chromosome that decides a particular characteristic. You'll also notice that we picked on specifically single gene inheritance. At National 5, we will not make you work out polygenic inheritance as something in a family tree. It's far too complicated. And just as an example, when you work it out, you need a table that looks like this. You won't do that until you get to university for biology. We looked at alleles, so the two forms of the gene. Obviously, you can have multiple alleles for a gene, but again, in National 5 genetics questions, they will give you two alleles to look at. One of them will be dominant to the other one, and they will either tell you or make it obvious in the question. We've got phenotypes, which is for us the appearance, but it's the outcome of the alleles. So the outcome of the genotype is the phenotype. It may sound weird to say it's the outcome. It's because if you think about it, you have genes in your body that allow you to produce insulin, for example, or that allow you to have a functioning neurological system. You can't really call those things appearance. They are the result, the outcome of the alleles. So the phenotype is the outcome of the alleles in the genotype. We've got dominant ones and recessive ones. So here we have the bigger one, the uppercase, which is the dominant, and the lowercase is always recessive. We have homozygotes who have two copies of the same alleles. Here we have homozygous recessive, and here we have what's called the heterozygote. If that was homozygous dominant, it would be capital B, capital B. We've talked about the parental generation, which is the first mating that we look at, the first couple. And we talked about the fact that their children are the F1, and any children produced from the F1 are the F2. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can use this to go back and look at any particular areas that you find difficult.